I know I'm a bit late with this video since it's almost summer, but technically it's still spring, so this checks out. Anyways, today I wanted to talk about some books that I have recently read that just have this very spring-like vibe to them, but most importantly books that remind me of one specific story, which is Howl's Moving Castle. And for that I decided to kind of separate this video into multiple points where for every book I will discuss how it reminds me of Howl's Moving Castle and whether it reminds me more of the original novel by Diana Wynne Jones or the Studio Ghibli version. So without any further ado, let's get into the video. The first book I'm going to talk about obviously is the one that I based this entire video on, so that is Howl's Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones. I read this book the first time around 1 or 2 years ago, and it immediately became one of my all-time favorites, and I decided to reread it this year because I wanted to tab it. You see, the tabs even match the cover. Very nice. And even though I wanted to, as I said, tab the book, I was listening to it as an audiobook, and every time something interesting came up, I just stopped and put a tab in. I was not expecting to like the book on my reread more than I did when I first read it. I think the main reason why was because I listened to it as an audiobook and the narrator did the accent specifically for Howl. I'm not gonna say more about it because I think that might also be a spoiler, but I really enjoyed it, and I think that was definitely one of the things that made the reading experience more enjoyable. I guess that's just the case in every time I say that I really enjoyed the book, especially if it's an audiobook, it's always because the narration is also good. So yeah. But yeah, let's get into what this story is about. I noticed that most of the times people get into this story by watching the Hayao Miyazaki's adaptation, and they get this idea of what it is from Hayao Miyazaki's point of view. So when they go and read the book, they get quite disappointed that it's not the same. And I would say the main difference is the tone in which it is written. So while you would describe Studio Ghibli version as whimsical, sort of melancholic, very fluffy, I would not use these attributes to describe Diana Wynne Jones's original novel. And I will get into it more why later, but first let's see what this book is about, because there are quite a lot of differences between Studio Ghibli and this book. In this book we are following Sophie, who is the eldest of the 3 daughters, and because of that she believes that she's carrying this great misfortune where she can do nothing in her life, and she gets cursed by a witch of the waste and turns into an old lady. So in order to try and get rid of that curse and just in general, she decides to go find this castle of Howl's, aka Howl's Moving Castle. Together they go on a lot of adventures and get into a lot of misfortunes throughout the whole story. It is very hard, honestly, to talk about this book without getting into spoilers. Even though with the summary that I gave you, you might think, well, that is similar to the Studio Ghibli version. The reason why I say it's different is because of the tone of the story. I already said what the tone is of the Studio Ghibli version, but if I had to describe the tone of Diana Wynne Jones's novel, if this book was part of the Discworld series, I would not be surprised. This story is much more goofier, it doesn't take itself that serious, and it has more of these very weird plot points, and one of those weird plot points is that thing that I don't want to spoil. Overall, it's much more goofy in its execution than the Hayao Miyazaki version. And one of the main differences in these stories is the character of Howl and the character of Sophie. Somebody really explained it well. And I think it's kind of like Hayao Miyazaki's version of the story is how Howl tells the story. But how Sophie tells the story is this book. Meaning that this is probably much more realistic than the Studio Ghibli one. Because Howl is, oh my god. In the Studio Ghibli version, you might fall in love with him. He seems like such a magical, whimsical character. But in this book, he is just so obnoxious, overly dramatic, and then top it off with Sophie's stubbornness. But one of the main things that Diana Wynne Jones wanted to accomplish in this novel is to show how flawed these characters are. But through these flaws, they managed to see themselves in a more real light. This story is a children's novel, but if you're reading it, you will see how whimsical, how beautiful Diana Wynne Jones's writing is. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's very easy to read this book, not just because it's a children's novel, but because it has gorgeous writing that just flows. And I guess the main criticism I would have about this story is that it's too short. I'm not saying let's get an epic fantasy rendition of this story, but I would definitely like to see more of Howl and Sophie constantly bickering, which is something that you can see also in very like small amounts in the other two books in this trilogy, because yes, Howl's Moving Castle is part of a trilogy, although the other two stories do not revolve around Howl and Sophie. They're like secondary characters or just like fleeting characters in those stories. So I had to change my shirt because it suddenly became too hot. But now I'm going to go towards the middle of this spectrum that I have made for the Howl's Moving Castle Studio Ghibli version versus the original version. And somewhere in the middle, I would say, falls A Sorcery of Thorns and Mysteries of Thorn Manor by Margaret Rogerson. Out of all the books that I'm going to talk about today, Sorcery of Thorns definitely has the biggest similarities with either of the Howl's Moving Castle stories, but Sorcery of Thorns follows Elizabeth, who was born and lived in libraries, and there are these sentient books called grimoires that can be quite dangerous if left unattended, and some mystery starts to happen where all these great libraries begin to burn, and with the help of a sorcerer Nathaniel and his demon, we are following Elizabeth on her adventures in trying to basically save the world. You could already see maybe some similarities. Nathaniel is a sorcerer. He also has a demon, as well as Howl and Calcifer. Nathaniel is this cocky, stubborn, overly dramatic type of a character as Howl. They both have a magical house because also in the Sorcery of Thorns, Nathaniel lives in this Thorn Manor that is, I guess you could say, sentient. So yeah, a lot of similarities, but the reason why I would place this book somewhere in the middle between Diana Wynne Jones's Howl's Moving Castle and the Hayao Miyazaki's one is because it has similarities with both of those. So on one hand, it does feature very similar motives as Hayao Miyazaki's one. It can definitely feel much more whimsical and fluffy than Diana Wynne Jones's novel is. But on the other hand, I think what Margaret Rogerson wanted to accomplish in this novel is to show this bickering between the two main characters, aka our love interests, which is definitely something that I can attribute to Howl and Sophie in the book. However, I am kind of sad that I have to say that I was very intrigued by this book. I was very interested in reading it, but the execution of it felt flat for me. I couldn't really relate to the story, and even though it had a lot of things that I usually adore in stories, somehow I didn't like the execution of it here, and I couldn't emotionally connect to the story. One of the things that I really like are books that talk about books, and this was kind of the whole premise of this story. And even though I really enjoyed this whole sentient books type of magic, I couldn't get immersed in it as much as I wanted to. Somehow I always felt like there was something more that I wanted out of the story, but I just never got it. Another thing that I wanted to enjoy, but I just couldn't really, is the romance between Elizabeth and Nathaniel. There were some sweet moments that I enjoyed for sure, but I never really got into it. The banter just felt very forced. It felt like it was unnatural the way they were communicating. But I think the main reason why I didn't enjoy the story as much as I wanted to is because I felt like the story was dragging for way too long, for basically the majority of the book. I felt like it could have been shorter. It could have been much more condensed than it was, because there was a lot of plot points that I just couldn't understand why they were there, and because of that the pacing felt a bit off, especially if you're going to introduce this romance subplot, because at some points it felt like things were just happening all of a sudden, and they were happening because you would expect them to happen. They didn't feel natural, and that was a similar feeling that I had in Uprooted by Naomi Novik, which I will talk about later. I guess what I missed the most in this story is this sort of build-up. For Howl's Moving Castle, I said that there was practically no romance throughout the entirety of the book, and then all of a sudden they're just like, and we lived happily ever after. In this book, you kind of get something, and then there's nothing, and then there's again a huge moment that happens, and then there's nothing. And because of that, it felt very unnatural. It felt like I was jumping from one thing to another, and I guess I just didn't enjoy that part. Now, this book is a novel, and it has a kind of a sequel novella called Mysteries of Thorn Manor, which I will say I did enjoy, maybe more than the Sorcery of Thorns. I think the reason why I enjoyed it is because it was short. It didn't try to build up to this whole we must save the world type of a plot line. It just had a very simple premise, and it was cute and fluffy, and that was the only thing that I cared about at that moment. So yeah, it was nice. But to be honest, it could have been just an extra few chapters or an extra very long chapter at the end of A Sorcery of Thorns. I don't think it needed to be a whole separate novella, but anyways, moving on. I wanted to talk about one other book now, but I think I will talk about Uprooted by Naomi Novik because I mentioned it in the whole Sorcery of Thorns, so I think that's what I'm going to focus on now because my thoughts are everywhere around that book. Uprooted follows our main character Agnieszka, who lives in this very small village that is being guarded by this sorcerer called the Dragon, and he lives in this mysterious tower. And the whole gist of the story is that every 10 years he decides to pick up a new girl from the village, and he takes her with him to the tower to stay for another 10 years. And on the year where a new girl is supposed to accompany him to the tower, everybody believes that it will be Kasia, Agnieszka's best friend, but lo and behold, Agnieszka gets chosen and the dragon takes her. And throughout the whole story, there is this dark, mysterious forest, and they need to figure out how to defeat the enemy, basically. When you just hear this, it sounds very engaging. It definitely feels like a fairy tale, and that was what pulled me towards this story. One of the other things that pulled me to this story is that it is based off of Slavic folklore, I think primarily Polish folklore. Because of all of that, the vibe, the atmosphere of the story is what drew me the most to it, and that is, it's a bit dark, it's mystical, mysterious, it's folklore, has elements of fairy tales, and all of these things sound so magical. But this book for me was such I don't want to say disappointment, but more I was left confused because I have my theory with this book that I'm going to come back to later. But yes, I did not understand certain choices that were made in this story. But first I want to say why I'm even talking about this book in this whole book similar to Howl's Moving Castle, because there are actually quite a lot of similarities with this book. This one falls more on the Diana Wynne Jones's spectrum of Howl's Moving Castle. The dragon, aka the sorcerer, or how we find out later that his name is actually Sarkan. He is Howl, quite literally, but also his opposite. What I mean by that, first of all, he's a sorcerer. He is incredibly obnoxious, overly dramatic. And one thing that makes me laugh the most is how in almost all of these stories, I forgot if that's also the case for A Sorcery of Thorns, but every single story, both Uprooted and the other one that I'm going to talk about how clean these characters are. So Howl, we learn in both the book and the movie, he's not exactly a clean freak. He likes to be messy. And then in these other stories, you constantly get the narrative that these characters are super clean freaks. And I think that's funny how they're constantly like trying to emphasize that point, because in Uprooted, it's told that Sarkan is a huge clean freak and he hates how Agnieszka is super messy. And in the other book that I'm going to talk about, you also have this super clean character and then the main girl is like super messy. And I don't know, I just like how all of these stories play on the opposites attract type of a trope. But now to go further into why this book was so confusing to me. The thing is, the first half of the story I absolutely loved. I got invested in this story so fast and I did not want to stop reading it at all. And then the second half of the story, I thought I was gonna have to DNF. What I've told you about the synopsis of this story is true for the first half of the book. It is a whimsical fairy tale-esque story that is set in this small rural area that is filled with magic, mysticism, dark forests. Like, all of these things are so engaging and intriguing, and that's what pulled me to read this story. And you get that in the first half of the story, but you kind of lose it towards the end. Basically, the story is revolving around Agnieszka, our main character in the first half of the story, and her relationship with Sarkan. And I don't mean just like romantic relationship, I mean more like her learning her powers, her learning more about this mystical forest, her learning more about the dragon, aka Sarkan, and you learn more about her village and everything. So the setting is very compressed. Like, you are in this compressed time and space because you're just following the lives of these small amount of people in this very small area. And that works for this story because, as I said, it's kind of like a fairy tale, and I think it just makes sense in the setting in which this book is set. But for some reason, after this beginning, the book takes on a whole new turn and suddenly goes from this mystical, small, rural area type of a story to a whole kingdoms raging war against one another. And I don't understand why was that necessary. I can understand trying to raise stakes, trying to make your story more action-packed because you think that might be more engaging, but it just doesn't work for this story, at least for me. I at least felt like there were no seeds planted for it in the beginning of the story. And even through the synopsis, I wouldn't have expected it. I feel like the synopsis is a bit misleading when it comes to this story because the first half of the story is what the synopsis is talking about. But the second half, I feel like, is just pulled out of a different book, and these two are just merged together like some sort of a Frankenstein monster. And this isn't about like, haha, plot twist. No, this is just, you had an expectation in the beginning of the story and you set up some things, and the reader wants to see those expectations being met, but instead you completely ignore them and continue on talking about something else that, in my personal opinion, has nothing to do with the story. And my theory is that if this book was a duology, this wouldn't be a problem, because then the first book could have focused just on the tower and the village and the mystical forest, and then you sprinkle in a bit of like some kingdoms raging war type of bullshit, and then in the other book you could focus more on the politics and the royals and everything of that sort. And then I think it would make sense. But what you got now is like two separate stories not having anything similar to one another. It was the same problem that I had with the pacing in Sorcery of Thorns, where just it made no sense how you completely ignore one part of the story and then you suddenly rush to it. In my personal opinion, I couldn't understand why those choices were made, and because of that, I'm very confused about how I should view this story, because as much as I loved the first part, that's how much I disliked the second. At this point, I know I look ridiculous, so here, I'm bringing back the tie. Because I also like how it looks like. It fits the whole, like, setting vibe of what I'm trying to go for. We have reached the final book that I want to talk about today, and it is the one that I love the most out of the whole bunch, excluding, I guess, Howl's Moving Castle. But I have a very interesting story connected to my liking of this book. So the book that I'm talking about, actually the series of books that I'm talking about, is the Emily Wilde series by Heather Fawcett. I read the first book last year, I think, and when I learned about this book, I was thinking, this is it. This is going to be one of my favorite books. I can't wait to read it. I am so excited. And I remember going to the bookstore, finding the book there, and being just my happiest self. I felt like a child in a toy shop. I got the book, I read it, and I think I rated it 2 stars. And if you ask me why I did that, I don't think I would be able to answer. For me, at least, there is a very big deal about the setting in which I read a book. And by setting, I mean the timing, like the time of my life when I read a story. That definitely influences your reading experience. And I guess I was not ready for that book at that time. But there was still that was left from this story inside of me that urged me to go and read the second book, which is Emily Wilde's Map of the Otherlands, the book that I will focus on today. This book became one of my all-time favorites. How is it that I go from the worst book that I read to the best book that I read? And it's part of the same series. Again, I think I might have to reread Encyclopedia of Fairies because I guess it wasn't the right time for me to read it. I really loved this one. It's as I said, one of my all-time favorites now. I can't even form sentences anymore because I'm just so confused with myself, but also happy because I found a book that I enjoy so much. But without all of that, let me first tell you a bit about this series. A lot of people already know about it, but let's just reiterate what we all know. Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies follows a scholar, Emily Wilde, who is trying to write an encyclopedia of fairies. You couldn't guess that from the title. And she is going on a trip to this remote land village where she will go and try to find out as much information as she can about this species of fae that not many were able to learn about. And on this trip, her academic rival joins her, Wendell Bumblebee. I keep always calling him Bumblebee because it's just his last name sounds like that. So for me, he will always be Wendell Bumblebee. And we just followed them along their journey of countless adventures, and that's all. In the first book, we already learned quite early on, so it's not a spoiler, that Wendell is actually one of the Fae folk. And in this second book, we learn more about him and more about this whole kingdom of his, I guess, like Fae realm, land. I forgot already the terms, but anyways. And this time they have a trip to the Alps. So yeah, fun. I don't know how much I should actually say about this story because it is a sequel, so perhaps a lot of people haven't read it yet because it also came out in the beginning of this year. So I'm not gonna go into too much spoilers, and I'm going to try to talk about these two books as one book, like one story. I already spoke a bit about what are the vibes of this book, but it's definitely light academia sort of a book with a lot of whimsical, magical, fairy tale-esque moments. This one does not have a lot of similarities with Howl's Moving Castle when it comes to plot points. However, the reason why I wanted to mention this book, besides it being a very like spring-like book, especially the second one, because the first one I do believe is set in this whole snowy region. But the reason why I wanted to connect it to Howl's Moving Castle is because of the characters of Emily and Wendell. What I said that did not work for me in A Sorcery of Thorns did definitely work here. In Diana Wynne Jones's original novel, Howl and Sophie are constantly bickering. They're constantly going on each other's nerves, and they have this very silly and flirtatious banter. And the same is in these two books, where Emily and Wendell are constantly in an all-out brawl with one another. Unlike in A Sorcery of Thorns, I definitely felt like it was more natural in this story than in The Sorcery of Thorns. This book is also written in the most different way than all the other ones because this is an epistolary novel. You're basically reading Emily Wilde's journals. That's also one of the things that are definitely very interesting about this story. Emily is a scholar, and as you're reading her journals, she also has these tiny footnotes where she's explaining what she's talking about through in-lore dictionaries, encyclopedias, stories. It's just so immersive and such cool world-building element. If you remember what I talked about Sarkan from Uprooted, it was very explicitly stated how Agnieszka is the one that is messy and Sarkan is the one that is a clean freak, and the same is here where Wendell is the one that needs to have everything completely clean and Emily is the messy one. And I just like how they're playing on this same idea from Howl's Moving Castle, but subverted to have Howl being the clean one and Sophie being the messy one. I don't know how to talk about this book without getting into too much spoilers, so I'm going to stop here, but I would like to reflect on all the books that I have talked about and say why I decided to pick these to kind of cover in this video. I wanted to make a video about books that when I think about them, I think about spring, I think about nature, I think about magic and fairies and everything. And even though not all of them have these elements, they still all have this similar vibe. But there are certain elements of all these stories that I just think work well together and create this cozy fantasy, whimsical, magical books. The first one is all of these books cover some sort of banter between the characters. The characters are not some people who just have a normal start to their relationship. What all of these stories do have also is the fluff. All of these stories that I talked about today are very cozy to read. They kind of give you this sense of warmth and happiness while you're reading them. What you will read these books for is the connections that all these characters create between each other, whether they're through friendships or they are more chosen family type of a dynamic. You always have characters that just get to know each other and start caring for one another, not in a romantic way. And I think that's a lot of times missing in stories, especially in fantasy stories. That do kind of focus more on the romance, because even though I do like reading romance, I think we're missing out a lot if we only focus on that type of love. I mentioned how I didn't really like A Sorcery of Thorns, but one of the things that I loved the most in there is the connection that Elizabeth created with Nathaniel's demon. Those moments are what makes this a cozy fantasy. These books value friendships, and I think that's why ultimately I will like all these stories, even if I didn't enjoy certain plot points or something. I will always cherish the fact that they decided to focus on this different type of love that we don't see often being portrayed in media, especially books that I'm talking about today. So yeah, I really like that. So those were all of the books that I wanted to talk about in today's video. If you know of any books or read them that kind of match the similar vibe or aesthetic of the books that I was talking about today, please let me know in the comments. And if you did read these books, let me know what you thought about them. I would really like to know. And yeah, that's all for me. See you next time. Bye bye.